Okay. Well, you guys know who I am, right? But for the camera, I will say I'm Lynn Hardy, author of Prophecy of the Flame, and this is The Road Less Traveled. It's a story, it's the panel on the road I took to publishing, and also the road I didn't take, and the difference in the two. Does that sound good?
Good.
Okay. So, first off, you might notice that my costume has changed if you've seen me around the con. This is my original costume. When I started out, let's step back a few steps. After I wrote a book, do you guys want to know why I wrote the book?
Yes.
Anybody interested? Okay. Well, I was in college, and they told me that I should drop my journalism degree because I couldn't catch my own typos. I will use this because they're kind of getting loud behind. So I couldn't catch my own typos, and we didn't have spell check yet. It was the DOS-based computers a long time ago. And so they're like, yeah, if you can't catch your own typos, you should give up your journalism dreams. So I dropped out of college, and I got married, and 3 or 4 or 5 years later, well, a couple of years later, we went to counseling, marriage counseling, and we learned how to communicate. Well, one of the things my counselor asked was that we write an autobiography with as much detail from our youngest memories possible. So I proceeded to hand her 10 pages, single-space typed every week. And after about 2 or 3 months, she says, I have to tell you, I have asked my clients to do this for 20 years. And this is the first time I want to sit down with a cup of tea and see what happens next in your life. She says, you just have a way of making the story come to life. You should consider something, along this lines. So about a year later, I had this awesome set of dreams. And I said, this is the story I have to write. Actually, first I said, who can I send this story to? This is such an awesome story. Oh, it's just great. I said, maybe Terry Brooks, or maybe Melanie Ron, or, I started thinking of all my favorite authors. And finally I decided, after trying to write an outline and failing miserably, because it was just so boring, that I would just sit down and write the story. So I sat down, started typing, and it literally took me 1 year, almost to the day, to write book 1 and 2 together. Then I got pregnant, took a couple years off, and then got pregnant again, and edited it. Then I got pregnant again, took another couple years off, and re-edited it a second time. And then I thought, well, what am I going to do with this? And I went and bought a Writer's Digest. You can buy it at any Barnes & Nobles. Have you guys heard of this? The Writer's Digest book? And I went through there and mailed it to every publishing company that accepted unsolicited manuscripts. I was rejected every single time. I call them politely the not at this time letters. We are not interested in your work at this time. So after that, I decided I probably needed an agent, but being from a small town, I wasn't sure what made a reputable agent. I was pretty leery. And I'd heard about you doing it yourself. And I thought, why don't I try that? So I just, started getting information online, and step by step. And this was 5 years ago. Figuring out how to make this happen. I went to a convention in Denver. It was a Christian convention. And somebody there said, oh, you want to write a book? Yeah, I've got this great publisher. And so I had a reference. He's like, this is self-publishing. So I went with this publisher, and they said they had an editor, which I paid them $1,700 to edit the 800 pages. And then when I went to go and submit it for publishing, it was 800 pages, 600 to 800 pages, and it was going to cost too much. So I'm like, what can I do? Well, Aragon just came out. Aragon 1. And I noticed he cut it right after the battle scene. And that seemed to be okay. He was a bestseller. So I'm like, hey, I have a major battle scene. Why don't I split it here? So I figured out a way to end it gracefully, and I self-published book 1. And when that happened, the publishing company, they'd quieted it down. So at that time, they didn't have these short runs of 100 books. You had to print 500 books every time. So I printed 500 books. And that was great. I had a awesome time. I kind of patterned it myself a little bit after Aragon. I had heard that he had gone to Renaissance fairs. And I'm like, hey, I can do Renaissance fairs. I just need a costume. And so in book 1, she's known for having her shiny silver robe. And it's a magical cloak that keeps her warm. Her body is always at the perfect temperature. And so I designed the cloak. I designed the clothes and proceeded to go to Renaissance fairs. And I made lots of money. Renaissance fairs are very kind to authors, especially with a fantasy book. Most of them put me right up front by the gate with a tent, and I would walk up to people and say, hey, I'm Lynn Hardy, I'm doing a book signing here today. And I would do my little spiel and hand them a flyer, and all profit. And that was really well, did really well. My first book signing at a Borders, that was my first official book signing in a bookstore, did horrible. I didn't know about the flyers yet, and I really didn't know how to talk to people yet. I hadn't gotten my spiel down, and so I was very clumsy and awkward. I sold 6 books in 4 hours. Do you know how long that is? That's 45 minutes before you sell a book. That was hideous. It was horrible and excruciating. But every bookstore book signing, I got a little more polished in my spiel, and I got a little more confidence. And every one I sold more and more books. I sold 8 the second time, then I sold 16, and then I sold 25. And before I left the Washington, D.C. area, which is where I published, I sold 40 books at a book signing. And that was the second time I'd been to that store. It was close to the airport. And when I sold those 40 books, they were like, oh, look, do you need anything? Oh, let me get you a coffee. And what kind of pens do you like to use? And when can you come back? I mean, any day, and you're here. As a matter of fact, Stephanie Meyer, do anybody know who Stephanie Meyer is?
No.
I did not. I had no idea who Stephanie Meyer was. This was 3 years ago. Her 4th book was debuting, I think, 3rd or 4th. And they said, yeah, there's this huge book signing coming up next Friday. And I saw the black books with the little apple on the front and stuff. And they said, yeah, she's got this new book debuting at midnight. She's going to be doing her midnight signing here at our store in Washington, D.C. And I had done my signing the weekend before. And they said, you have to come. They said, your book, is fantasy like hers, and you'll sell all of your books. Just come. She's going to sell 1,000. You'll probably sell a couple hundred. And we were leaving for Idaho on Thursday. Her book signing was Friday night. I begged my husband. I'm like, honey, please, just, start driving back to Idaho. I'll fly and meet you in the city. Just let me do this book signing. He's like, no, I am not driving with a cat and 2 kids across country without my wife. So I did not get to do my book signing with Stephanie Meyer. Near miss. So then after that, I moved to Idaho. When I moved to Idaho, I thought, oh my gosh, how am I going to sell books from Idaho? In D.C., you drive 4 or 5 hours, you're in a new bookstore. Drive 8 hours, you're at a new Renaissance fair. There's tons of places to sell your books and make money. So I put down my book. I'm like, I guess it was a fun ride. I made $7,000. Oh, I forgot about the video game contract. I'm sorry, this is very informal. I forgot my outline. I misplaced it. Before I even did my first book signing, that was when I was in the video game store. Does anybody recall that story? Do you want to?
I wasn't here for that.
You wasn't here for, so I'm sorry, I'll repeat it. So it was my first shipment of books, 500 were being mailed to me, and I had no place for them to deliver them. I was like, oh my gosh, how is this going to do? Because they were going to bring them on a truck, and you had to have a loading ramp, and I'm like, man. But it was still like a month away, so I was still scrambling, trying to put something together. And I went to this video game store, and I started talking to the manager about video games, and then I told him, oh yeah, I've got a book coming out. It's a fantasy game, because we were talking about some fantasy games. So I said, oh, it's a fantasy book, and I told him, what it was about. And he's like, oh, that is an awesome book. He said, that sounds great. It sounds like it would make a great video game. And I'm like, yeah, you could do this and that. Well, after talking with him about half an hour, he said, well, you have to do a book signing here. So I booked one of my first book signings at his store. And and matter of fact, he volunteered to let me have my books delivered there, because I told him about my delivery issues. So my books were delivered to his store. And we did a book signing there. And his name was JR. And then we talked. The book signing was horrible at the video game store. That's where I sold like 8 or 10. So it was really slow, and I had lots of time to talk to him. And we talked more and more about the video game. And so then he invited me to lunch the next week. And then he invited me to another engagement. And after about third or fourth time, he said, so, what can we offer you a contract? He said he was opening his own video game company called Hypocrite Games, that they had independent investors, and that he had put together a crew, and he would like to make the video game out of my book, that he thought it was perfect for launching his company. So that was very, very cool. We started contract negotiations, which lasted 3 months. Oh my gosh. He would send me suggestions, and I would send him revisions. So about this time, while we were negotiating, I went to a Renaissance fair. And some guy there said, oh, this book would be great at cons. And I went, cons? What is that? Sounds like a prison. so he's like, oh, it's this great place. They do sci-fi and fantasy stuff, and they have authors there, and you're an author. You should bring your book there. And he had read my book. And I said, okay, sounds fun. So we exchanged email addresses, and he happened to know the con director, guest liaison at this big con in North Carolina. And he gave me all the information. I looked it up online. I'm like, this looks like an old Star Trek convention. Here's the Klingons, here's Starfleet. It was a science fiction convention. I said, okay, well, I'm really a Star Trek geek from way back. I've seen every episode known to man. So I was cool with that. I was like, this sounds awesome. So I went to my first convention. I met Mike Resnick. Does anybody know who Mike Resnick is? He has done more science fiction and fantasy stuff than any other author, including Asimov and Bradbury. Yeah, and so I went to this convention, and this was my first time ever as an author at one of these things. And because I was self-published, I was not well liked. Have any of you heard this story? So I walk in, and the great part about it is my table was right next to the big authors. I mean, but I had to pay for it. I had to pay $200 for my table. Nobody else, the regular authors, when they get invited, they don't have to pay for their tables. So here I am, paying for my little spot, hawking my books, and people came in, and I always do the same thing. Hi, I'm Lynn Hardy. I'm an author here doing a book signing. And they were like, these people were like, oh yeah, and hustled past me. And then every time I saw them, they would walk this wide circle around me. And I'm like, okay, I don't think I said anything to offend them. I just gave them my name and that I was an author. And I couldn't figure out why they were walking this circle around me until they did their first signing. They were Faith Hunter. Anybody know her? She's a big fantasy writer. And David, I can't remember somebody else, but they were all best-selling authors, and they were there. And matter of fact, Faith's husband, he actually shook my hand, and he would not even tell me what he did for a living. Oh, this, that, and the other thing. Wink, wink, smile, And so he did very little talking to me, but I believe in graciousness. Kill him with kindness. So when they snobbed me, I was like, oh, they were talking about going to lunch. I'm like, well, hey, I'm going to be here. I can watch your books if you want. How much are you selling them for? And they're like, oh, that would be great. Yeah, So they had their books on their table, and I, would help sell them and, trying to be nice. Rod Hunter and I, Faith's husband, talked a little tiny bit, and I guess he saw me working the crowd, and I was selling quite a few books. And then not only that, I had 3 people come up and say, oh, I got to chapter 4, and oh, it's just so awesome, your book is so great, and so I had a few people, and oh, so-and-so told me I had to get your book, so it was kind of a good thing. And so about the last day, the very last day there, Mike Resnick came in for a signing, and Rod, he put all of his books on this edge of the table and made Mike sit right here, and my stuff was right here. So he basically forced Mike to sit right next to me. So he had no place to go. And so he kind of did me a favor. And so Mike sat down, nobody was coming up, and we started chatting a little bit. And he saw my book, and he's like, oh, you're an author. And he picks up my book, and he says, oh, who published this for you? And he turns it over to the spine. And I said, oh, I started my own publishing company. And he threw it down. He goes, oh, you're not published. No one's paying you to write. You're paying yourself. So I'm like, you know, it was really harshly put, and I was really struggling not to be offended. But I just said, you know, I would really love to be published. I said, but most places won't even take a submission unless you have an agent. And I said, and I have no idea how to get an agent, you know? And he's like, well, you should do this, and you should do that, and, you know, you should be doing this, and lecturing me, basically, giving me pointers on what to do next. After we talked for quite a while, I remembered I hadn't checked out yet, and it was 1 o'clock. I was like, oh my gosh, I need to turn in my room key. You know, so I'm like, I'll be right back, you know. So I walked calmly to the doorway and then dashed to the front desk, dropped off my room key, and dashed back. And he was still there, you know. But he was holding my book, and it was open, and he was reading it. And I was like, so I quietly come up and sit down, and he's like, put the book down. I'm like, yeah, no, I wasn't reading it, you know. and he said, he looks at me and he shrugs, and he says, you know, Daw and Bain, they publish stuff just like that. No, actually, he didn't say that. He said, you have a typo in your first paragraph. And that was my first edition with a really lousy edit. I had my second edition just come out, so I had sold 400 books. And I said, yes, I know. And I said, but I have corrected that and many other mistakes. I said, I didn't realize that just because you call yourself an editor, you actually do a good job. So I presented him with the new book. And he read the first page. And then he said, yeah, he shook his head. And he goes, you know, Bain and Daw, they print stuff just like this. One of the two should pick it up. At that point, Rod snapped a picture of us sitting there together, and made a phone call to Holly McClure. She was the agent there at the con. That's where you find agents, is at cons. And said, you have to come here now. Get over here now. So apparently that was like the green light on my book, on my work. So I thought, woohoo, I've made it. I've achieved my goal. I've self-published. I've got the attention of the publishing world. You know, because Holly was there in like an hour. She was out. She was really out. She was on her way home. So they called her back, and she offered me a contract to be my agent. And Rod told me, I would sign you right now. He said I was going to ask you to be with our small imprint. And he gave me his card. He said, I'm with Bella Rosa Books. We're a small publishing company, and I was going to offer you a contract. He said, but I won't do you that disservice. With Mike Resnick's recommendation, you'll probably go a lot further. So there I had my first publisher, small press, offering me something, and I had an agent. And so that's where it began. So this is the part I don't tell anyone. So you'll have to cut it here for a line.